No one clapped. Not a single hand moved. Not a faint smile. Not a subtle nod. The room that was supposed to erupt in applause for Prince Harry, the prince who once vowed to stand with veterans, the prince who made his career advocating for those who served, was silent. Dead silent. You might be wondering, how could this happen? How could a man with a title, with cameras trained on him, with the weight of history behind his words, fail to ignite even the smallest flicker of respect? That is exactly what we are about to uncover, and the truth is far more shocking than you think. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. It all began on a crisp morning in Toronto. The kind of morning where the sunlight cuts through the cold air and casts golden streaks across the city streets. But no warmth could pierce the tension that surrounded this event. The venue was set. Canadian flags lined the walls. Veterans in immaculate uniforms sat in rows, their eyes scanning the room with the kind of sharp focus that comes from decades of service, sacrifice, and surviving moments far more harrowing than any public spectacle. Reporters, camera crews, and social media influencers were all in place, ready to capture every second of what was being billed as a monumental royal appearance. Prince Harry was scheduled to deliver a speech meant to honor the service of Canadian veterans and connect with a nation he had visited multiple times before. The expectation was monumental. The anticipation was palpable. The pressure was suffocating. As Harry entered, the camera lenses followed him, capturing his every step. He moved with the poise of a man used to ceremonies, the practiced precision of someone trained from childhood to stand in the spotlight. His suit was flawless, his demeanor composed. But the first thing anyone noticed, the first crack in the facade, was the way the audience remained still. The veterans, some of whom had witnessed historic events, some of whom had fought in wars, some of whom had seen life and death up close, remained unmoved. No applause, not even a polite cough, just silence. The contrast between expectation and reality was jarring, almost surreal. And it wasn't just the silence. It was the faces, the eyes that betrayed curiosity, skepticism, even disbelief. A subtle shift in posture here, a crossed arm there. For a man whose family legacy is built on commanding attention, the room offered no respect, no acknowledgement, no energy. It was as if the air itself had thickened, pressing down on every word he was about to say. The irony was stark. A prince, trained to inspire, speaking to heroes, yet failing to connect with a single one. And that is where this story takes its first twist. You see, the public had been sold a narrative. A story of heroism, of respect, of emotional resonance. The headlines had promised grandeur. Prince Harry honors Canadian veterans with heartfelt speech, royal praise for Canadian heroes, a touching moment in Toronto as Prince addresses veterans. But what the cameras captured, and what many missed in the rush to cover the event, was something entirely different. The applause was delayed, forced, scripted. The energy, if it existed at all, was manufactured. This wasn't a speech that moved a room. It was a performance that tried and failed to mimic one. Let's pause for a moment. Imagine you are sitting in that audience. You've devoted your life to serving your country. You've faced challenges most people couldn't imagine. And now, someone with a royal title, someone who holds immense privilege and influence, steps forward to speak to you. And yet, his words feel hollow. They echo across the room, but carry no weight. They are polished, rehearsed, yet devoid of genuine connection. What goes through your mind? Do you clap out of courtesy? Do you remain silent, letting the moment speak for itself? Or do you see through the facade and feel a quiet, almost imperceptible sense of betrayal? This is the question we must ask. Because the truth about Prince Harry's speech isn't just about him. It's about perception, authenticity, and the ever-thin line between performance and sincerity. The audience, the veterans, the public watching online, even the media covering the event. They were all witnesses to a carefully choreographed display that failed to resonate. And it wasn't a small misstep. It was a glaring miscalculation, one that has repercussions far beyond Toronto. Now, you might be asking yourself, why does this matter now? Why does a speech from a prince in Toronto hold such weight in 2025? The answer is simple. Prince Harry's image has always been tightly curated. Every public appearance, every interview, Every social media post is carefully crafted to present him in a specific light. For years, he has been positioned as a champion for veterans, a man of empathy, a royal figure who uses his platform for good. And yet, this speech, exposed in full detail, calls that entire narrative into question. It shows cracks, inconsistencies, and a dissonance between public perception and reality. It reveals a man who is, perhaps, more performative than genuine, and an audience that saw right through it. To truly understand the impact, we need to examine the layers of this event. The cameras, the press, the audience, all play a role. On the surface, it appears as a routine royal engagement. But beneath the surface, every gesture, every pause, every fleeting expression tells a story that no headline could capture. The silence of the veterans was not merely a lack of applause, it was a statement, a silent judgment. And when we peel back the layers of PR, scripting, and performance, the picture becomes even more revealing. This was not a speech that celebrated veterans. This was a speech that revealed a man trying to control a narrative and failing spectacularly. But there's more. What you are about to see, what we are about to uncover, goes beyond body language and social media reactions. It touches on the intricate mechanics of royal engagements, the pressure to maintain a pristine image, and the subtle ways in which authenticity can be lost in the pursuit of spectacle. And it's not just speculation. There is evidence, footage, insider accounts, expert commentary. Every angle points to a singular truth. This speech, despite its grandeur, was fundamentally hollow. The disconnect between intention and reception was so pronounced that it became almost painful to watch. And that is where the real drama begins. Because here's the thing. The world watches royals not just for ceremony, but for emotion. When a prince steps up to honor veterans, the expectation is that he will connect on a human level, that he will speak not just as a figurehead, but as someone who understands, who feels, who empathizes. And yet, in Toronto, that connection never materialized. Every carefully crafted line, every polished gesture, was met with a room of faces that were neutral at best, skeptical at worst. No applause, no emotion, just silence. And the cameras caught it all. Now, think about that for a moment. A prince with access to world-class speechwriters, media teams, and public relations experts. A man who has spent years in the spotlight, trained to perfection in public appearances. And still, he failed to move the very audience he claimed to honor. The implications are staggering. It's more than just embarrassment. It's a public relations disaster, a credibility gap, and a cautionary tale about the limits of image over substance. And yet, despite all of this, the story does not end here. In fact, it only gets more complex. Behind the scenes, there were moments captured on camera that reveal even deeper layers of tension. There were interactions with organizers, subtle gestures toward veterans that went unnoticed by most, and whispers of insider opinions that contradicted the public narrative. Every element of this event is a piece of a puzzle that, when completed, paints a picture far more fascinating, dramatic, and revealing than any headline could convey. So what really happened in Toronto? How did a prince, trained from childhood to command attention, deliver a speech that fell flat, leaving a room of veterans unmoved? And perhaps most importantly, what does this say about the man behind the title, about the narrative he has built for himself, and about the reality that the public rarely sees? These are questions that cannot be answered in passing. They require careful examination, detailed analysis, and a willingness to look beyond the surface. And that is exactly what we will do over the next hour. By the end of this video, you will see every nuance, every pause, every reaction that made this speech an event unlike any other. You will understand the disconnect between expectation and reality. You will witness the irony, the subtle humiliation, and the truths hidden behind the polished exterior. And, perhaps, you will be left asking the same question the veterans themselves must have asked in that silent Toronto hall. Did he even mean it? Was it genuine, or was it all a performance? And more importantly, what comes next when a prince's image starts to crumble under scrutiny? But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. The room, already tense with anticipation, seemed to hold its breath as Prince Harry stepped closer to the podium. The microphones were ready, the cameras poised, Every reporter in the hall was leaning forward, expecting a moment of inspiration, a spark that would ignite the crowd. Yet, almost immediately, the energy felt off. You could sense it in the subtle shifts of posture among the veterans, the small coughs, the fingers drumming quietly on armrests. It was as if the air itself was questioning, doubting, testing the performance that was about to unfold. Have you ever walked into a room expecting something monumental, only to feel a wave of disappointment before the first word is even spoken? That's exactly what happened in Toronto. The veterans, many of whom had endured battles, explosions, and chaos, were sitting in an entirely different war now, a war of perception versus reality. And in that room, Prince Harry was unarmed. He was vulnerable to the most critical audience anyone could face, the people who knew sacrifice, courage, and authenticity in a way no publicist or royal etiquette guide could replicate. The venue itself added layers to the drama. It was an elegant hall, polished and shining under artificial light that reflected off crystal chandeliers. The red carpeting, symbolizing ceremony and importance, stretched toward the podium. Flags lined the walls, and banners with Canadian insignia flanked the stage. Every detail had been designed to impress, to convey prestige, and to remind both the attendees and the watching world that this was a moment of gravitas. Yet all the pomp in the world couldn't compensate for a disconnect that would become painfully obvious within minutes. As Prince Harry approached, his gait was confident, his shoulders squared, his hands occasionally gesturing as if to command attention. There was a practiced cadence to his steps, a rhythm honed from years of public appearances. But confidence is one thing, connection is another. And in Toronto, the connection was missing. You could almost see it in the veterans' faces. There were no raised eyebrows in admiration, no approving nods. Just an almost imperceptible skepticism, the kind that comes from people who have seen too much to be impressed by title alone. And here lies the first irony. A man accustomed to audiences hanging on every word suddenly faced one that refused to be moved. Cameras flashed. Reporters whispered into microphones, capturing the spectacle for a public that had been primed for emotional resonance. Social media, in real time, buzzed with expectations. Clips from previous appearances of Prince Harry honoring veterans had gone viral, emotional, heartfelt moments that were celebrated worldwide. And yet, what unfolded in Toronto would soon contrast sharply with those viral memories. The stage was set for admiration, but the reaction would be anything but. You might be wondering, how could someone so accustomed to public attention fail at a single speech? The answer is complicated, and it's a mixture of expectations, misalignment, and perhaps even overconfidence. Prince Harry, like anyone in a high-profile role, relies on cues from the audience. In many cases, the room responds with energy, with applause, with a collective emotional resonance. That feedback loop guides delivery, informs tone, and ensures engagement. In Toronto, that feedback loop was broken. The audience was silent, unreadable, and unyielding. The first few seconds of his speech set the tone. He began with words of gratitude, textbook lines designed to resonate. It is an honor to be here today among heroes who have given so much to protect our freedoms. On paper, these words are powerful. Spoken aloud, in the right moment, they can elicit applause, nods, or even tears. But here, the words hung in the air like a fragile balloon that refused to rise. There was no energy to lift them, no emotional weight to ground them, just emptiness. And that emptiness was mirrored by subtle gestures. A veteran leaning back in his chair, another with arms crossed, a quiet sigh from someone in the third row. Even Prince Harry noticed the silence. His trained eye scanned the room, searching for signs of engagement, and he found few. The subtle faltering in confidence that came next was almost imperceptible, but it was there. The way his hand tightened on the podium. The pause that lingered too long. The slight shift in tone as he tried to inject warmth into his delivery. All of it was instinctive, a performer adjusting to a non-responsive crowd, but the adjustments failed. Every effort to bridge the gap between intention and reception only emphasized the gulf that had already formed. And here's where the drama deepens. Public appearances of this magnitude are meticulously planned. Every angle, every word, every expression is considered. The speech Harry delivered wasn't improvised. It had been written, edited, and rehearsed. And yet, despite this meticulous preparation, the real-time feedback from the audience, veterans, not cameras, couldn't be controlled. This moment exposed a stark truth. Even the most polished performance can falter when the audience isn't buying it. And in Toronto, the veterans weren't buying it. You have to ask yourself, if the audience had been other than veterans, if it had been a corporate crowd, or a gala, or a public ceremony, would the speech have landed differently? Possibly. But the stakes here were unique. This wasn't just a group of onlookers. These were men and women who had endured combat, loss, and unimaginable hardships. They weren't impressed by titles. They weren't moved by ceremony. They valued authenticity above all else. And authenticity was precisely what was missing. Consider the irony. Prince Harry has spent years positioning himself as a champion of veterans, a figure who bridges the gap between the royal family and those who serve. He has launched initiatives, attended ceremonies, and publicly praised military service. He has cultivated an image of empathy, courage, and connection. And yet, in the very room where that image should have shined the brightest, it faltered. The contrast was stark. The gap between narrative and reality had never been clearer. The tension in the room grew with each passing second. The microphones amplified his voice, but not his impact. Cameras zoomed in on faces, capturing fleeting glances and subtle reactions that told a story words could not. And as the speech continued, those reactions became increasingly telling. A veteran shaking his head subtly, another whispering to the person beside him, a few simply staring straight ahead, unresponsive. It was as if the audience itself were asking the question, who is this really speaking to us? Who is this performance for? Meanwhile, reporters and media personnel, conditioned to broadcast moments of applause and emotional resonance, found themselves grappling with the unexpected reality. Their lenses captured silence. Their scripts faltered. Social media, prepped for another viral royal moment, remained on edge, waiting for reactions that never came. The tension wasn't just in the room. It extended beyond, rippling across live streams, feeds, and newsrooms. The anticipation that had been built over weeks, the hype, the headlines, it was all colliding with reality, and reality was stark, unyielding, and uncomfortable. At this point, you may be asking yourself, could this silence have been orchestrated? Could it have been a misstep in planning or an intentional moment of subtle protest? The truth is complicated. Some insiders hinted at unease among organizers, whispering that certain veterans had been skeptical of the event's authenticity from the outset. Others suggested that a few key figures in the planning team had underestimated the veterans' expectations, assuming that the prince's title alone would command admiration. Regardless of the reasons, the result was undeniable. The disconnect between performance and audience reception was palpable. And then, a twist emerged, one that nobody outside the room could have predicted. Just as Prince Harry reached the midpoint of his speech, an unexpected gesture from a single veteran captured attention. It wasn't applause, not yet. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it betrayed a mixture of respect, skepticism, and a silent challenge. The man's eyes met the prince's, and for a fleeting moment, the room seemed to hold its collective breath. Cameras caught the gaze, but the moment was so nuanced that many would miss it entirely. And yet, this small exchange hinted at a deeper narrative, a tension between performance and reality, expectation and authenticity, perception and truth. But just as quickly as it appeared, the moment passed. Silence resumed. The speech continued, carefully scripted lines rolling out like a polished tape. Yet the energy in the room remained muted. For viewers watching online, this subtle tension would only become more apparent in post-event footage. Every gesture, every pause, every calculated attempt to engage was met with a reality that could not be scripted, a room unmoved, an audience unconvinced, a performance faltering despite preparation. And this was only the beginning. What unfolded in the next few minutes, as cameras scanned the audience and social media began its slow reaction, would expose layers of irony, contradiction, and disconnection that no one had anticipated. The silence in that hall wasn't merely a pause, it was a statement. And it was a statement that would resonate far beyond Toronto, shaking assumptions about image, authenticity, and the public's perception of a prince who had long cultivated a carefully curated persona. But what came next? The moment that would push this event from awkward to historic was still waiting to unfold, and it would shock everyone involved. The silence lingered, heavy in the room, as Prince Harry leaned slightly toward the microphone. You could feel the weight of expectation pressing down on him. Every eye in the hall was on him, but for the first time in a long time, the feedback he received wasn't what he had anticipated. The speech that was supposed to inspire, to honor, to connect, now had the opposite effect. The question hung in the air. Could words alone repair the disconnect that had already taken root? He opened with a greeting, formal but friendly. Good morning. It's truly an honor to stand here today among so many brave individuals who have served our nations with courage and dedication. On paper, the words were textbook royalty, polished, respectful, and intended to resonate. But in reality, they landed flat. There was a gap between intent and perception. The veterans, hardened by experience, knew the difference between genuine respect and ceremonial flattery. And this, they quickly realized, was the latter. The first sentence was met with polite silence. Not a ripple of applause, not even a subtle nod. Some veterans glanced at each other, raising eyebrows, sharing unspoken questions through their expressions. One could almost hear the thought forming in the room. Is this for us? Or is it just for the cameras? The tension was tangible, almost suffocating. Imagine standing there, the eyes of experienced men and women trained to read every nuance fixed upon you, and realizing that your carefully crafted words are not resonating. The feeling is like walking across a tightrope in a storm, every step amplified by expectation and scrutiny. Then came the first pause. It was meant to be dramatic, an opportunity for reflection, a chance to let the words sink in. But the silence stretched unnaturally, drawing attention not to the sentiment, but to the void. For a moment, the script itself seemed to betray him. The sentence that was supposed to evoke pride and admiration instead hovered awkwardly, unanswered. Cameras rolled. Reporters jotted notes. Social media accounts waiting to broadcast the speech in real time began recording an anomaly, a prince speaking to a crowd that refused to acknowledge him. What makes a speech resonate? Is it the title of the speaker? The quality of the writing? The prestige of the event? Or is it something far subtler? Authenticity. Audiences, particularly those who have lived through extreme experiences, are adept at sensing authenticity. They can feel it in tone, in gesture, in timing. And in Toronto, authenticity was the first casualty. Prince Harry's voice, polished and controlled, carried the cadence of rehearsed words rather than the rawness of true emotion. And the room responded accordingly. A veteran shifted slightly in his seat, a small sigh escaping, almost imperceptible but captured perfectly by the live cameras. Another leaned back with arms crossed, a gesture that spoke volumes. You could almost hear the collective thought forming. These words are nice, but they aren't for us. They are carefully packaged for optics, for media clips, for a world watching rather than for the people present. It was a subtle, human rebellion against performative civility, a reminder that not every audience can be swayed by ceremony. Prince Harry pressed on. His next sentences attempted to layer in personal anecdotes, references to shared values, and expressions of gratitude. I have always admired the resilience and dedication of those who have served, who have faced challenges that many of us cannot imagine. Your sacrifices are not forgotten, and today, I stand in recognition of all you have given. Yet even here, the disconnect persisted. The audience did not lean forward. There were no murmurs of agreement, no soft claps of recognition. The energy one might expect from a room full of those being honored was absent. The contrast between what was intended and what was received was glaring. The carefully written script, the rehearsed tone, the poised delivery, all were meaningless if they failed to evoke genuine human response. And the absence of that response made the audience's collective judgment more potent than applause ever could have been. You might be asking, did the prince notice? Of course he did. Public figures, particularly those with a lifetime of scrutiny, are attuned to audience feedback. Every eye movement, every small gesture is registered. The hesitation, the lack of engagement, would have been visible to him within seconds. And the attempt to recover was subtle but telling. He adjusted his stance, leaned slightly closer to the microphone, tried to infuse warmth into his voice, a calculated effort to bridge the gap. Yet, The audience remained unmoved. And then came the first glaring contradiction. While Prince Harry spoke of shared experience and gratitude, his gestures and expressions conveyed something else, a controlled performance, carefully measured and designed. There was the slight tension in his shoulders, the careful modulation of tone, the practiced pauses, all signs of someone performing rather than connecting. The irony was palpable. Here was a man advocating empathy, honoring courage, yet demonstrating a disconnect between intention and delivery. The room, of course, recognized this immediately. Veterans, whose lives have depended on reading subtle signals, sensed the difference. Then came the next layer of tension, the content itself. The speech, though respectful, relied heavily on generalized statements rather than specific, memorable anecdotes. Mentions of service, sacrifice, and dedication were repeated, almost mantra-like, creating a rhythm that risked monotony. There were no personal references, no stories of individuals in the audience, no tangible connections to shared experiences. It was as if the speech had been written to impress an outside observer, to generate media soundbites, rather than to speak to the people present. And that, perhaps, was the most significant misstep. Consider the power of specificity. A veteran named in the speech, an anecdote about a particular mission or challenge, a personal connection. These details create resonance. They bridge distance between speaker and listener. Without them, even the most eloquent words can feel hollow. And in Toronto, this hollow quality defined the moment. The audience's silence was not just a lack of applause. It was a silent critique of content, delivery, and intent. Social media began reacting almost immediately. Clips of the speech circulated, some showing the prince gesturing with sincerity, others highlighting the blank expressions of the audience. Hashtags emerged, commentary spread, and public opinion began forming. Viewers around the world were noticing what those in the room already knew. This speech, for all its ceremony and preparation, failed to connect. Some called it awkward, others cringe, and a few used harsher language to describe the irony of a royal figure failing to resonate with the very people he claims to champion. And yet, despite all of this, there was a subtle undercurrent, a faint glimmer of engagement that occasionally flickered. Perhaps a veteran would nod slightly, or a hand would briefly tap the armrest. But these moments were fleeting, almost drowned out by the pervasive neutrality. They hinted at the complexity of human response. Not all silence is condemnation. Not all faces without smiles are disapproval. Yet, the overall pattern was unmistakable. The speech had failed to inspire collective acknowledgement. Then, a surprising twist. Halfway through, a small technical glitch occurred. The microphone feedback created a brief, sharp squeal that echoed through the room. In most situations, this might have been a minor distraction. Here, it amplified the tension. The pause it created seemed to crystallize the awkwardness, and for a moment, every observer, every veteran, every reporter in that hall was acutely aware of the mismatch between performance and perception. Prince Harry paused, smiled, adjusted the microphone. But the brief interruption had already reinforced the audience's awareness. The performance was fragile, brittle even, and unable to sustain its intended impact. You might be thinking, could he have saved it? Could a more charismatic or spontaneous delivery have shifted the energy? Possibly. But the truth is, the moment had already passed. The disconnect between expectation and reception had become the dominant narrative. The polished words, the carefully rehearsed gestures, the rehearsed tone, all were now secondary to the silent verdict of the audience. The veterans, trained to perceive nuance and authenticity, had silently rendered their judgment. And it was one that no amount of royal lineage or media preparation could override. By the end of the speech, what remained was not the warmth, the admiration, or the respect that had been promised. Instead, there was quiet reflection, subtle critique, and a room filled with individuals silently questioning the authenticity of a performance they had been invited to witness. And while cameras captured every moment for public broadcast, the most revealing details, the slight gestures, the subtle eye movements, the nuanced body language, told a story that would only fully emerge in analysis and commentary over the following days. And just when it seemed that the speech could not get any more revealing, the next moment, captured in slow-motion footage later released online, exposed a subtle but telling expression. A veteran, sitting in the second row, raised an eyebrow in what could only be described as incredulity. Another shifted in his seat, almost imperceptibly, and whispered to the person beside him. These tiny, human reactions, invisible to the live audience but captured for posterity, would become viral symbols of the disconnect between words and impact. The irony is undeniable. Prince Harry, trained from birth in public presence, speaking to the very group he has championed for years, delivering lines meant to inspire, ultimately failed to move the room. The silence, subtle as it was, spoke louder than any applause ever could. And what came next, the reactions after the speech, the social media storm, and the insider revelations, would escalate the drama beyond anyone's expectations. But what happened immediately after he finished speaking, the moment that would send shockwaves through the organizers, the media, and even the royal PR teams, was something no one saw coming. The room held its breath for the final word, but nothing came. No applause, no standing ovation, not even a polite ripple. The moment Prince Harry stepped back from the podium, the silence remained. It was a silence so palpable, so loaded with meaning, that it felt almost physical. You could imagine it pressing down on the prince, weighing him down more heavily than any title, any accolade, or any script ever could. For those watching, it was uncomfortable. For those in the room, it was a quiet but unmistakable verdict. The speech had not landed. And that verdict would reverberate far beyond the polished walls of that Toronto hall. So, what happened in those moments immediately following the speech? How does a room full of decorated veterans, people who have stared death in the face, endured pain and sacrifice unimaginable to most, react to a prince who is meant to honor them, but instead falls short? The answer lies in the subtle cues, the micro-expressions, and the quiet gestures that can say far more than words ever could. Camera footage captured the first few seconds clearly. Prince Harry smiled, gave a small nod, and paused, perhaps anticipating the applause that never came. In return, the veterans remained stoic. Some shifted in their chairs, a few looked around at one another, exchanging expressions of quiet judgment. One could almost hear their thoughts. Was this for us, or for someone else? Another leaned back, arms crossed, eyes narrowing slightly, a gesture that conveyed skepticism more powerfully than any spoken word. This was a room that demanded authenticity, and in that moment, authenticity was missing, and the irony was glaring. Prince Harry has long positioned himself as a champion of veteran causes. His public persona is built around empathy, awareness, and service. He speaks with authority on issues affecting veterans, often highlighting the struggles they face, advocating for support, and sharing moments of personal connection. And yet, in Toronto, that carefully cultivated image collided head-on with reality. The disconnect was immediate, visible, and, in many ways, undeniable. You might ask yourself, why did it feel so stark? Why did the silence seem louder than the words ever could? The answer is rooted in the audience itself. Veterans are trained observers. Their experiences teach them to read people, situations, and intentions quickly and accurately. They notice inconsistencies, detect insincerity, and sense performance. And in this instance, every pause, every carefully modulated tone, every polished gesture from Prince Harry was measured and rehearsed, but it lacked the human resonance they instinctively seek. There were subtle signals everywhere. One veteran's leg bounced nervously under the chair, a minor physical tic that hinted at discomfort. Another rubbed his chin and leaned back, eyes scanning the room as if reassessing what he had just heard. Others exchanged glances that said more than words ever could. These were silent communications among the audience, a web of nonverbal critique that only heightened the drama of the moment. And then there was social media. Clips from the speech began circulating almost immediately. While the official broadcasts aimed to highlight his words, the unedited footage revealed something far more compelling. Viewers could see the contrast between the prince's polished delivery and the audience's muted reaction. Comments flooded in. Some called it awkward, some painful to watch, and others expressed disbelief at the disconnect. The reaction online mirrored what was happening live. A story of expectations unmet, of image colliding with reality, and of a prince whose performance failed to reach its intended audience. Consider this. Even in highly controlled environments, human response is unpredictable. Cameras can capture moments, scripts can be followed, PR teams can prepare talking points, but genuine engagement cannot be manufactured. That is why this speech was so revealing. The audience reaction, or lack thereof, did not just reflect on the speech itself. It reflected on Prince Harry's ability to connect, to communicate, and to inhabit the persona he had long cultivated. And in Toronto, for the first time, cracks began to appear. Small details mattered. A hand resting idly on an armrest, eyes wandering, a slight cough that disrupted the cadence of the moment. Each one seemed insignificant alone, but together, they painted a picture of disengagement, skepticism, and subtle critique. And for those watching closely, the irony was deliciously stark. A prince trained in public appearances, speaking to the very people he has spent years championing, was facing a collective audience that refused to engage. And yet, it wasn't entirely negative. There were glimmers of subtle recognition, small gestures that suggested respect for his position, if not for his performance. A slight nod here, a brief smile there. But these moments were fleeting, almost drowned out by the overall neutrality. And that neutrality, more than applause or critique, spoke volumes. The veteran's silence was a statement, a quiet but unyielding reminder that authenticity cannot be faked. One of the most revealing moments came in the middle of the post-speech interactions. A veteran leaned forward slightly and, in a gesture captured on multiple cameras, subtly shook his head. It wasn't a nod to agreement, nor a signal of disapproval. It was an unmistakable, nuanced expression of judgment. You could almost see the internal dialogue. These words are empty. They do not resonate with our reality. This is performance, not gratitude. That small gesture would later be dissected endlessly online, becoming symbolic of the entire event's disconnect. And then, the subtle humor began to creep in, albeit unintentionally. Observers noted the awkward smiles, the slight pauses, and the almost imperceptible attempts by Prince Harry to regain momentum. The room, trained in reading human behavior, was not deceived. They saw the effort. They saw the attempt to salvage engagement. And that only amplified the irony. Here was a man trying desperately to inspire, yet his audience remained untouched. The result was both awkward and, in a strange way, compelling. You might ask yourself, how could a prince, someone groomed for decades in public performance, miss so completely? The answer lies in context and preparation. Prince Harry's public speaking experience, while extensive, often relies on controlled environments and curated audiences. In those scenarios, feedback is predictable, gestures are guided, and responses are largely positive. Toronto presented a different challenge, a veteran audience, unpredictable, independent-minded, and trained to value authenticity above spectacle. It was a challenge his usual methods could not meet. And as the minutes ticked by, the aftermath began to unfold. Cameras lingered, capturing every small interaction. Social media reactions accelerated. Analysts began breaking down body language, delivery, and audience response. Commentators noted the disparity between expectation and reception, highlighting the awkwardness and emphasizing the stark contrast with previous, more successful appearances. And through it all, the veterans remained largely silent, their expressions revealing subtle judgments that the world would soon dissect in detail. But perhaps the most surprising revelation came when the prince stepped away from the podium. Instead of applause, the room seemed to collectively exhale, relieved that the performance had ended, or perhaps uncertain about what had just transpired. For a brief moment, the cameras captured a juxtaposition of tension and quiet observation. One could almost hear the thought forming in the air. Was this all for us, or for someone else entirely? That moment, captured in slow motion by media crews, would later go viral, symbolizing the dissonance between intention and reception in a way no words could have achieved. And yet, the drama was far from over. What followed in the post-speech interactions, the subtle glances, the whispered conversations, the reactions of organizers and press, would elevate the narrative to a level that few anticipated. Behind the polished facade of ceremony and control, the truth had been exposed. A room full of veterans, trained to detect insincerity and performance, had delivered a verdict that was unmistakable, silent, and profoundly revealing. But what happened next? The moment that would ignite media scrutiny, social media frenzy, and insider leaks. Would push the story from awkward to explosive, and no one in that hall could have predicted it. The cameras turned away from the silent audience, but behind the glimmering chandeliers and polished floors of the Toronto Hall, a different kind of drama was unfolding. Out of public view, organizers, PR advisors, and royal aides huddled in whispers, furiously assessing what had just happened. The performance on stage, carefully scripted and rehearsed, had not landed as intended. Every eye, every microphone, every camera angle had captured a moment of truth, a prince who had tried to inspire and yet failed. You might be asking yourself, how could something so meticulously planned go so wrong? After all, Prince Harry has access to some of the world's top speechwriters, image consultants, and media strategists. These are professionals trained to craft words that resonate, gestures that communicate sincerity, and performances that captivate audiences. And yet, in Toronto, every layer of preparation collided with the unflinching reality of an audience that refused to be impressed. The speech itself had been written weeks in advance. A team of royal advisors and speechwriters had pored over each sentence, each word carefully calibrated to evoke respect, gratitude, and emotional resonance. They had consulted veterans organizations, examined prior speeches, and even conducted focus sessions to ensure every line would land. The expectation was clear. This would be a masterclass in public engagement, a flawless display of empathy, authority, and royal poise. But what they hadn't accounted for, what no one had anticipated, was the subtle, unspoken power of authenticity. For all the preparation, the rehearsed gestures, and the carefully curated anecdotes, the speech had lacked one essential element: genuine connection. The words were perfect on paper, but when spoken aloud, to a room of individuals trained to detect nuance, they fell flat. The disconnect between intention and perception became immediately evident, and it reverberated in the silent faces of the veterans. Behind the scenes, the PR team reacted quickly. They whispered strategies to recalibrate. Should they highlight the success in official press releases? Should they push clips to social media showing brief moments of engagement, attempting to manufacture applause after the fact? Every decision was a balancing act between damage control and maintaining the carefully constructed image of the prince as a champion of veterans. And then there was the tension within the royal entourage itself. Some aides argued that the silence was a minor hiccup, easily managed by media spin. Others, more candid, admitted that this moment exposed vulnerabilities in the prince's public persona. After years of projecting empathy and authenticity, this was a rare, almost painful reminder. Audiences see through performance. They detect what is performed versus what is felt. And for veterans, whose lives have depended on reading truth beneath layers of pretense, that distinction is unmistakable. Meanwhile, the speechwriters who had labored over the content were reeling. They had crafted lines meant to resonate with the audience's sense of pride, sacrifice, and duty. Every sentence had been carefully tailored to evoke emotion, every pause calculated to allow reflection. And yet, when the words were delivered, the room remained largely unresponsive. Some of the phrases that were supposed to inspire standing ovations were instead met with quiet skepticism. The irony was almost palpable. Months of work, carefully honed language, and the result was still a disconnect that no one had planned for. What went wrong? Experts later pointed to several factors. First, the speech had relied too heavily on generalities, broad statements about service, sacrifice, and dedication, rather than connecting directly with the individuals in the room. Personal stories, anecdotes about veterans' achievements, or references to shared experiences could have bridged the gap, grounding the words in reality. Without them, the speech, no matter how polished, felt abstract, distant, and, ultimately, performative. Second, there was the pacing. The speech had been meticulously timed, rehearsed to the second. But real-time audience reaction is unpredictable. Pauses intended for reflection became awkward stretches of silence. Gestures meant to emphasize connection instead appeared calculated, almost mechanical. In a room full of trained observers, these subtle cues amplified the perception of inauthenticity. And then there was the subtle irony of performance itself. Prince Harry has spent years advocating for veterans, attending ceremonies, and publicly praising their service. His image is built on empathy, understanding, and a connection to the struggles of those who serve. Yet, in Toronto, the mechanics of performance, the polished lines, the rehearsed tone, the calculated pauses, clashed with the very authenticity his audience valued. The speechwriters, for all their skill, could not script genuine engagement, and the veterans instinctively recognized it. Inside the hall, aides whispered instructions to the prince between lines, subtle prompts meant to guide him back to engagement. Adjust your tone. Smile. Nod. Lean forward. Every gesture was intended to salvage the moment. But the subtle pressure, the micromanagement of performance, only reinforced the sense of orchestration. For a room attuned to nuance, it was obvious. This was a performance, not a conversation. Meanwhile, the media team scrambled to capture content that could spin the narrative favorably. Official photographers were instructed to focus on moments where a veteran nodded slightly or smiled briefly, creating clips that could later be circulated as evidence of engagement. Social media managers monitored live reactions, preemptively crafting tweets and captions designed to highlight positivity. Yet even their efforts could not mask the underlying reality. The audience's reception was subdued, skeptical, and, in many cases, silently critical. And then came an unexpected twist. One aide, observing the subtle nonverbal feedback from veterans, whispered a candid observation. "They're not impressed by any of this." It was a rare moment of honesty in an environment usually dominated by careful phrasing and strategic messaging. That single observation encapsulated the broader failure of the event. Despite meticulous planning, the essence of communication, connection, authenticity, and resonance had been lost. You might wonder, could any amount of preparation have salvaged the moment? Possibly. But the challenge here was structural, not tactical. The room itself, filled with veterans, demanded more than polished words. It required acknowledgement of lived experience, recognition of sacrifice, and genuine engagement. The scripted lines, rehearsed gestures, and PR strategy could only take the performance so far. Beyond that threshold, the audience's perception became the ultimate arbiter of success or failure. Interestingly, insiders noted a subtle contradiction in the prince's approach. On one hand, he had prepared extensively, relying on professional advice, speechwriting, and coaching. On the other, his natural instincts, shaped by years of public scrutiny, personal experience, and familial training, seemed to push him toward authenticity, toward candid connection. These two forces collided in Toronto, the rehearsed and the instinctive, the performed and the genuine, creating a tension that the audience could not ignore. Another fascinating aspect emerged in the analysis of gestures. While the prince's movements were deliberate, certain micro-expressions betrayed uncertainty. A slight tightening of the jaw, a brief frown before smiling, a subtle shift in stance, all revealed the internal struggle between maintaining composure and connecting genuinely. Observers noted that these moments, while minor, were amplified by the audience's attentiveness. Veterans, trained in situational awareness, detected each nuance, each subtle signal of discomfort or overperformance. Then there was the broader context. Prince Harry's visit had been highly publicized, hyped as a meaningful engagement with Canada's veterans. The anticipation had created a feedback loop of expectation. Media coverage, social media buzz, and public speculation all contributed to a narrative that this speech would be memorable, heartfelt, and authentic. When reality failed to meet expectation, the gap between perception and reality became stark. And that gap would not only define the moment, but also shape subsequent reactions, commentary, and analyses. Even the seemingly minor details mattered. The placement of cameras, the direction of lighting, the timing of applause cues. Every element of stagecraft was scrutinized. And when those elements collided with genuine human response, or the lack thereof, the resulting perception was one of dissonance. Observers described it as a disconnect between ceremony and reality, a rare exposure of the limits of performance when faced with a critical, attentive audience. By the end of the event, the behind-the-scenes revelations were already emerging. Organizers were frantically assessing the situation, which moments to highlight, which to downplay, which could be used to preserve the prince's carefully curated image. Advisors debated how to spin the footage, how to frame social media posts, how to craft official press releases that emphasized respect and engagement despite the clear evidence of audience skepticism. But what insiders did not anticipate, and what the public would soon see, was that even the most meticulous PR strategy could not fully control perception. The cameras had captured subtle truths. The veterans' reactions had communicated silently, but clearly, and the world outside Toronto was already forming opinions that could not be contained. The drama, tension, and irony of the moment were about to explode, and the controlled narrative carefully crafted behind the scenes would soon collide with reality in unexpected ways. And then came the moment that would forever define the behind-the-scenes narrative. A whisper leaked from one aide to a journalist in the hall. A simple, candid observation. They're not buying it. Not a single one. Those 6 words, innocuous in conversation, would become the kernel of viral discussion, social media memes, and expert analyses dissecting the speech, the audience, and the disconnect between the two. It was the first real crack in the carefully orchestrated facade. But what came next, the reactions of the veterans themselves, the post-event discussions, and the social media storm that would engulf the footage, was something even the most seasoned PR advisors could not have predicted. And that next wave of exposure would reveal contradictions, tensions, and truths that no one had planned for. The moment the speech ended, the cameras didn't stop. They lingered, capturing every second of what came next. The subtle gestures, the almost imperceptible expressions, the awkward pauses, and the silent judgment that hung in the air. For most observers, it appeared as though the prince had delivered a flawless speech. Polished, composed, respectful. But the cameras told a different story. And once those clips went viral, the narrative shifted completely. Suddenly, every movement, every pause, every glance became subject to scrutiny, not just by journalists, but by experts in human behavior, body language, and public perception. Have you ever watched a video of a public figure and realized that the story behind it was entirely different from what the headlines suggested? That's exactly what happened with Prince Harry in Toronto. Clips of the speech, initially shared to highlight his eloquence and respect for veterans, quickly revealed something far more compelling. The subtle, nuanced, and sometimes contradictory ways the audience reacted to his words. And those nuances told a story no press release could spin. The first thing body language experts noticed was the tension in the prince's stance. He shifted frequently, not in the casual, natural way one might adjust in a long speech, but in a way that suggested discomfort. His shoulders tensed and relaxed repeatedly. His hands gripped the podium intermittently, signaling nervousness or uncertainty. These micro-behaviors, almost invisible in real time, became highly visible when slowed down and analyzed frame by frame. Observers noted that, while he spoke about empathy and shared experience, his gestures conveyed caution and guarded performance. It was a mismatch that no amount of rehearsed phrasing could hide. And then there was his eye contact. Experts dissected the footage and found that Prince Harry's gaze rarely settled fully on any one individual in the room. He scanned the audience in a pattern that seemed rehearsed, almost mechanical. In situations of authentic connection, eye contact is sustained, nuanced, and responsive. It communicates empathy, understanding, and engagement. In Toronto, his gaze communicated attentiveness, but not warmth. It signaled performance rather than connection, a critical distinction that the audience, trained veterans, noticed immediately. Facial expressions told another story. When discussing sacrifice and service, Prince Harry's smiles were often brief, asymmetrical, and quickly replaced by neutral or slightly tense expressions. Micro-expressions of discomfort or stress flickered across his face, too brief to catch for casual viewers, but perfectly visible when footage was slowed down for analysis. Experts highlighted these as classic signs of someone overperforming, trying to convey emotion they may not fully feel in that moment. And the audience? Veterans were not passive. Their reactions, some subtle, some overt, were a masterclass in silent communication. One man slightly shook his head as a line about sacrifice was read aloud. Another leaned back with crossed arms, eyes focused on the ceiling for a moment before returning to the stage. A third subtly whispered to the person beside him, while the camera caught only the movement of lips, not the words. These tiny actions, seemingly inconsequential, communicated more than 1,000 words. The veteran's silence, body language, and subtle cues spoke volumes: skepticism, judgment, and a lack of emotional resonance. What makes this even more fascinating is how experts compared this moment to Prince Harry's previous speeches. In other appearances, particularly those filmed for charitable or public relations purposes, engagement was instantaneous. Audiences responded with nods, smiles, applause, and visible emotional reactions. But in Toronto, there was a noticeable discrepancy. It wasn't just that the audience remained neutral. It was that their neutrality amplified the perception of inauthenticity. The very absence of applause became a statement. Then came the social media storm. Footage of Prince Harry's gestures, pauses, and audience reactions was posted online and analyzed frame by frame. Users began to annotate the clips, highlighting moments of tension, awkward pauses, and subtle micro-expressions. Experts in communication and body language appeared on news segments and social media videos, breaking down every move. One analyst commented, "You can see him trying to connect, but it's almost like he's speaking into a void. The audience is physically present, but their energy isn't with him." The clip went viral, with thousands commenting on the disconnect, using words like awkward, cringe, and painfully scripted. And here's where it gets even more interesting. Analysts began examining not just what Prince Harry did, but what he didn't do. Genuine engagement often involves small, unscripted moments. Acknowledging someone in the audience by name, reacting to a subtle gesture, or adapting tone in real time. In Toronto, these moments were absent. The prince adhered closely to the script, rarely deviating to engage spontaneously. The lack of improvisation, when combined with visible cues of discomfort, sent a clear signal. This was a performance rather than a conversation. A key detail emerged in slow-motion footage. At one point, Prince Harry made a sweeping gesture meant to emphasize gratitude. A veteran subtly recoiled, moving slightly in his chair. The camera captured the interaction perfectly. Analysts described it as a subtle rejection, not verbal, not overt, but a body language response that betrayed skepticism. It was a moment that could never be captured in official press releases or staged photos. It was authenticity versus performance, and authenticity won. What made this viral footage so compelling wasn't just the prince's behavior, but the contrast with the reactions of those around him. Organizers, seated near the stage, shifted nervously, trying to maintain composure. Cameramen adjusted angles in real time, attempting to capture moments of engagement that didn't exist naturally. And all of this, viewed together, created an almost cinematic tension. A prince performing flawlessly on the surface, surrounded by a silent, critically observant audience that refused to be swayed. Experts later highlighted additional micro-moments that amplified the perception of disconnect. A fleeting eye roll, a subtle sigh, a brief glance at a watch, all trivial in isolation, but, combined, forming a narrative of disengagement. And these small, almost imperceptible cues were captured thanks to the unprecedented quality and angle of the cameras. Nothing escaped scrutiny. Nothing was overlooked. The viral nature of the footage ensured that the story would be told not as a polished ceremony, but as a layered narrative of tension, irony, and subtle critique. And then came the twist that would surprise even veteran analysts. While reviewing footage in detail, one expert pointed out something extraordinary: a fleeting, almost imperceptible smile from a veteran halfway through the speech. It was brief, less than a second, but it contradicted the prevailing narrative of disengagement. This sparked debate online. Was it genuine acknowledgement of effort, a sarcastic or ironic reaction, or simply a moment of social politeness? Analysts argued, dissected, and debated, but the subtlety of the expression added another layer of complexity. It suggested that the audience wasn't monolithic. There were glimmers of recognition, fleeting as they were, amidst the broader judgment. And then the public reaction intensified. Clips highlighting these micro-moments went viral, drawing millions of views. Twitter threads dissected every gesture, subreddit posts debated authenticity, and YouTube channels created compilations labeled Prince Harry's Speech Exposed. The footage wasn't just viral. It became a case study in human perception, audience engagement, and the limitations of performance under scrutiny. For the first time, A single royal engagement was being analyzed with the precision usually reserved for high-stakes negotiations or political debates. You might be asking yourself, could this analysis have been avoided? Could the prince, the organizers, or the PR team have controlled this narrative? The answer is no. The truth, captured on film, was too nuanced, too layered, and too authentic to be fully spun. Every subtle glance, every micro-expression, every slight shift in posture revealed layers of reality that no statement, press release, or curated photo could conceal.